Welcome back. So this video represents a pretty big milestone in this class. We're moving from purely front-end technologies to our first taste of back-end web development. So we're going to continue using everything that we've learned, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but we're going to learn some new technologies that help us make full web applications. Of course, before we start writing some code, we have a few other things we need to take care of. We'll start by reviewing how the internet works. Then we're going to talk about static versus dynamic sites and where front-end fits in, where back-end fits in. And lastly, we'll talk more in depth about the specific back-end technologies that we're going to work with. Okay, so let's start with the 60-second version of how the internet works. When we go to a URL like udemy.com/courses, there's a few things that happen behind the scenes. The first thing is that our computer needs to figure out what IP address to send a request to. So it takes this URL, udemy.com, and it gets the correct IP address, which is the unique locator for Udemy's server. Then once we have that IP address, a new HTTP request is sent. So a request is sent to that IP address, and it's not just a blank request, it has a bunch of information. We'll talk more about the specific details that are in that request in the next video, but the short version is that it has things like your own IP address, the time that you're sending it at, the type of request, and most importantly, the specific page that you're asking for. So in this case, we're asking for the courses page. So that is encoded in the request that is sent. Next, Udemy gets that request and it figures out what to do, and then it responds with something. So if we're asking for /courses, the Udemy server will figure out what needs to go on the courses page. So I would assume that it goes into a database and grabs a bunch of courses and images, compiles them into this one long HTML file with some CSS and some JavaScript, and then it's finally sent back to me, to my computer, as a HTTP response. And then it gets to our browser, whose job is to render the page. So this is what the actual content looks like before our browser takes care of it and renders it for us as humans. This is what the computer sees. Just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. To summarize all of that, when I go to a URL and I hit enter, first thing that happens is we need to find the IP address for that domain. And then we send an HTTP request asking for a particular page to that IP address. And then the server receives that request, it figures out what to do, what to respond with, and then it responds back with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The next thing I want to discuss is the difference between static and dynamic web pages. We talked about this also in one of the early videos about how the internet works. I want to do a quick recap because it's important to the back-end discussion that we're about to have. So there are two different types of websites, static pages and dynamic pages. Dynamic web pages are sites that are compiled on the server side, where the server is pulling together or constructing a web page before it's sent back as a response. Everything we've written so far has been static. So even something like this, that it doesn't seem like it's static because there's dynamic content. We get random colors every time, and it's a game. It doesn't seem as static as the restaurant web page example that I used on the earlier video on this topic. But it still is static because it's the same HTML, CSS, and JavaScript every single time. Yes, it looks different because we have some random colors, but it's the same fundamental pieces every time that we're opening in the browser. On a dynamic website, we could have different JavaScript or different CSS, different HTML that's being sent back every time. So when we go to something like Reddit, for instance, and I refresh the page, I can get different content here. And in fact, I do. Every single time you refresh the page, you get new content. And so there's a database that's compiling things. There's some code checking if you're logged in. And if you are logged in, then it won't show you a form over here, but it will show you a log out button. And if you're not logged in, it shows you a form, and it shows you login or sign up buttons. So this web page is not the exact same HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's sent back to me every time. The server is actually deciding what to send back and constructing a web page before it sends it to me. Versus this site, it's the same exact content every single time. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on the back end now. So this diagram is of a generic stack, and stack is a term that's used to refer to all of the technologies that a particular web application uses. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are always or almost always part of a stack. Nowadays on big fancy web apps, technically we could have a website that doesn't have any CSS. It would just be hideous. We could have a website that doesn't have any client-side JavaScript as well, and it just wouldn't be very interactive, but we could still make a perfectly good website like we did with the original photography portfolio site, just HTML and CSS. But most web apps, as I mentioned, all have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's being sent back. On the back end is where we see a lot more variance. So there are different languages that we can write server-side code in. We can write our backend using Ruby, or Python, or Scala, or Java, or JavaScript, or PHP. There are so many choices there. There are all sorts of different databases out there, Postgres, and SQLite, and MySQL, and Mongo, and there's so many choices. So the term stack refers to what particular choices the developers made and what exact technologies that they use. It's a very common question for developers to ask one another, what's your stack at that company? Or what stack are you using on this specific project? So here's a real-life example of Reddit's stack. So these are some of the technologies that Reddit uses on its website. So the site is written in Python using a framework called Flask. It's built on an Nginx server, and it uses Postgres as its database. There's actually a website devoted to sharing different company stacks called StackShare. So I have it open here, and this is the Reddit page on StackShare, and we can see all the different technologies they use. Nginx, Python, Postgres, Amazon S3, and it tells you below a little bit about what they're used for. Don't be overwhelmed by how many icons there are and how many names and all these different categories and all these different terms. That's not the focus here. All I want to show you is that different websites use different technologies. So let's click on Stacks, and we can take a look at some other company stacks. For instance, Airbnb. You can see that Airbnb uses Rails and Ruby. They use MySQL, lots of JavaScript, Java. They use a whole bunch of different technologies. So let's go back to our slides here. Another thing I want to bring up is that this blue line right here denotes the boundary between backend and frontend. So we discussed how a dynamic site is constructed by a server on the backend. So this right here, this part of the diagram, is where the dynamic part of the site comes in. So this is all the logic written in Python in Reddit's case that figures out if a user is logged in, if we need to show a form, what ad to add into the page, what images to put in, if we need to have a sign up and log in button or a sign out button. All of that is done in the backend in this part of the diagram. And then it sends back HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So here's the stack that we're going to be learning. We're going to use Node.js, so we'll still be writing JavaScript, but we're going to be writing it on the back end. We're going to use a framework called Express, and we're also going to use MongoDB as our database. And then of course, we'll also have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like we've been using in the last few units. So right now, at this point in the course, you can consider yourself a front-end developer or a front-end developer in training, where we've covered everything you need to know to start making the front ends of websites. Now we're going to start talking about back-end web development, and once we bring those two together towards the end of the course, where we're writing server-side code with Express and Node.js, MongoDB, we have user login, but we're also writing client-side or front-end JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. That's what we would call full-stack web development. The term full-stack web development refers to writing code on all parts of the stack, the back end and the front end. Here's a diagram of some of the functionality that we can implement on the back end. And this is using Reddit as an example again. You can see we have features like check if the user is logged in, sign up a user, add a new post to the database, create a new comment, remove a post from the database, sort and rank the posts, create a new subreddit, add a subscriber to the newsletter, and save that in the database. And the most important one, of course, is figure out what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to send back to the user which is then sent back, crossing this blue line, where we're now going to the front end. That HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is sent back to me, and then I see this in my browser. I have one more diagram here that also talks about front end versus back end, but it's formatted slightly differently. This diagrams the sequence of events between front end and back end over the course of a few page loads. So on the front end, if I go to reddit.com and refresh, I'm sending a request for the Reddit homepage. And then that goes to Reddit, that request makes it to their server, and the server sees that I'm asking for the homepage. So there's some server-side logic that grabs the top post from the database and makes all the HTML and CSS and JavaScript that I see here, and then sends that back to me, which I then view in my browser. The next step is that I could type something into a search box like dogs, which I'll do right now. Type dogs here and hit enter. And when I hit enter, a new request is sent back to Reddit server, this time saying that I'm searching for dogs. So the server has some logic that takes my search term, dogs, and it finds all the posts that match that term in the database. And then it makes me some new HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the dogs results page. And then it sends that back to me. And then my browser renders it, and I see this. That's a very, very simplified version, obviously. There's a lot more happening behind the scenes in Reddit. We'll actually be creating our own version of an application very similar to Reddit once we learn more about Express and Node.js and MongoDB, and we'll be making a full stack application.